Hello, everybody. Welcome to the One Voice COVID-19 Update webinar. Today, September 11th. This is Paul Nathanson with the Policy Resolution Group, and I am joined, as always, with my colleague Caitlin Sickles and the folks from the Franklin Partnership, Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. Just a reminder that you could hear all the previous updates, and this one will be posted on our onevoiceinfo.org website. And so we encourage you to visit that website in order to find out the latest. We keep that website updated with state regulations, what's going on with federal regulations regarding COVID, and it's a great resource for our members. So please make sure that you visit that site. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to get us started.
Well, thanks, Paul. We're going to thank you, everybody, for our bi-monthly webinar here. We're going to talk today about some recent clarifications. EEOC has issued, OSHA has issued some, EEOC, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, CDC. So we're going to sort of unwind the differing guidances moving forward. We're going to update you on what OSHA is doing. We've been talking about it for the last several weeks. They've increased their activity and their enforcement. We're going to have a discussion about where states are on the enhanced unemployment. We'll update you on that. And then we're going to talk about the government shutdown, the next COVID legislation, the skinny bill that was taken up by the Senate yesterday, and then give you a sense of where we see the next legislative vehicle, the next stimulus package moving forward. Then, towards the end of that presentation, we're going to have another survey. So be prepared. We're going to give you about 30 seconds to complete a survey, a quick flash survey, which will be helpful for us moving forward as we meet with policymakers. We'll talk a little bit about the PPP, the forgiveness process. We'll turn it over to Paul and Caitlin to update you on some media. We got a good hit the other day in the New York Times, and then of course we'll be able to answer questions. Don't worry about waiting till the end of the webinar to ask your questions in the box on the lower right-hand side of the panel. Feel free to ask questions throughout our presentation, and we will try to address them. During our presentation.
Yeah, before I let John jump in here on the EEOC, sorry, John, one last thing that we added here, and I just even neglected to tell you because it was just hot off the press. Quickly, OSHA issued a final guidance just early this morning on masks in a hot indoor environment. And so it doesn't affect all of our shops, but as we get into the winter season and you start closing up some of the doors out there, here's an additional guidance that just came out late last night and this morning with regards to heat stress that's out there. So sorry, just didn't mean to interrupt you, John, but just want to throw it out there. Not going to go through it, but just know that this is out there, especially as we get into the colder months. Y'all are going to close your doors and it can get hot in there, but you still might have to wear the mask. This guidance will give you a little bit of update there. Sorry, John, why don't you go ahead here on the EEOC?
No problem. These webinars are all very fluid, and oftentimes we get information the night before that we ended up adding into the presentation. So it's just very fluid. So there has been discussions. There has been differing guidances between the EEOC, the Americans with Disabilities, the CDC, and so they issued some clarification. For example, in this example is, can an employer administer a COVID test? And then the ADA says, well, yes, if it's job related and it meets the business necessity criteria. What does that mean? So that if you are testing everybody coming into your workplace, you're giving them a test, that meets the criteria because you are providing a safe workplace moving forward. And so therefore it is allowed. And further, the tests, if they're being administered based on CDC guidelines, it does meet the ADA's business necessity test moving forward. Omar, there are a couple more specifically about whether, what individual managers, what individual employers can and cannot do.
Yeah, that's right, John. I mean, basically, I think what we're seeing here, and again, we can't give labor or legal advice, but the sense that we're getting, I think, John, is that the EEOC is realizing that some of the previous guidance that they had provided on webinars back in March and April really don't conform with the updated CDC guidance. And so we understand there's a conflict with the current law and statutes, but also they're understanding that we're in extraordinary circumstances here where they do want to be able to provide employers some additional and maximum flexibility within some boundaries. And so here you're starting to be able to see the question John answered on A6, that's probably the most significant of the changes that have been put out here this week. But we'd also take a look at A9 and 10 here. This top question says, can the employer just simply ask a particular question only of an individual employee, or do they have to ask it of everybody? Effectively, they're saying you'd have to have a reasonable belief based on some type of evidence that the person might in fact have COVID-19. So again, they don't go into details on what that reasonable belief, but I think you can probably use some of your judgments. We are in, especially in a social media age. However, looking at it, the inverse side of it, what you can and cannot ask your employee, still some of these laws are taking effect and are still remain in effect rather, such as the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And that one does still prohibit employers from asking employees medical questions about their family members. So even let's say you do see maybe that individual was not out on the boat party and crowded and all that, but you saw that a sibling or a child was, and then they obviously are residing with that person. No, you still can't ask them if their child or that person that was there. So again, seek legal advice if you do have some questions like this, but that gives us some additional clarification here. And then lastly, looking at the manager that supposes that someone might have symptoms associated with COVID-19, the manager knows she must report it, but is worried about violating confidentiality. What should they do? Yeah, this comes back to, let's say you're working within a cell, there's a number of you, 5 or 6 employees are typically working together, and obviously one of them has been gone for two weeks. The rest of them can kind of assume what's going on. So they are still trying to do and ask you to take as much effort as possible to limit the number of people who know the individual employees' names. So as the employer, be sure you're not the one that's disclosing. And for the reason for leave that's out there, if rumors start flying around, then you obviously have to follow whatever HR guidance that you have out there. But John, to that effect, OSHA isn't lying down. They just put out some additional stats showing how they're trying to improve the workplace safety and enforcement out there.
And we've been talking to you guys for weeks and months now to make sure, to do your hazard assessment within your facility and such, and gave many recommendations. This chart just shows how OSHA is increasing their activities. Now, we feel pretty confident. Now, just because you're doing everything doesn't mean you will avoid a violation, but you're doing best efforts to comply with OSHA regulations. Our concern is not so much you guys who are on this webinar. Our concern is the people who are not on this webinar, who haven't been following necessarily the guidelines moving forward. And then the second chart shows, so they have activities, so they've got about 8,000 activities, actions moving forward. And then what happens with that. And so if there is violations, whether it's a PPE violation or such, here workers are removed from the workplace because of that situation. And so here this chart shows that almost 60,000 workers were removed. We also want to move to the unemployment. We talked a little bit about 2 weeks ago, the President's executive actions, which provided $400 in extended unemployment benefits, $300 from the feds and $100 from the states. The states had to sign an agreement with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and each state had various levels of sophistication in their unemployment computers. And so some have taken longer to get those payments out and processed. And this website here gives you an idea of what individual states are, what is the status of each individual state in the expenditure of the enhanced unemployment benefits. But Omar, we just learned this morning about some states are already running out of this enhanced unemployment benefits.
Right. Yeah. As we talked about earlier with in a few episodes ago, I guess few webinars ago now, some of the challenges that we've got with the executive branch, the way that it's structured, is that really a lot of the power of the purse still does remain with Congress. It doesn't matter who's president. So any president's always limited in what they can do, which is why in the president's efforts to try to help Americans and get some cash in their pockets, they were being creative, frankly, and thankfully so for some folks that need it and maybe not for others. But in what they did, they went and used a program called a law called the Stafford Act. And so they reprogrammed about $44 billion of hurricane disaster money and made it eligible as part of this lost wages assistance program, where the federal government provides $300 towards the unemployment assistance if a state provides a minimum of $100. And as you saw a couple of weeks ago, most states that were participating, in fact, I think all but 1 or 2 did. And then you now started to see the warnings that the government put out earlier is they might run out of money pretty quickly. And so, in fact, they have. FEMA has notified this week Texas and Tennessee that they will no longer receive funding to provide that $300 match from the federal government. So they're running out in that pot. Montana has told funding is going to be cut off today, September 11th. Iowa as well just started payments last week. but they were notified that their allotment is probably going to be wrapped up this Friday as well, not giving them very much time. Similar with Arizona, released a notification on Wednesday, similar to that effect. So again, the challenge is if they were going to extend the unemployment insurance, and I know that Paul and Caitlin and Bracel will talk about that a little bit more and what's going on, some of our efforts to educate the policymakers of some of the damage that the $600 had done initially and some of the issues still remain around it. But take a look and you'll get a sense that in the next couple of weeks here, even some of the state funding support through this FEMA partnerships drying up. So we'd be interested later on in your stories if we still have challenges hiring, if both the federal 600 is gone and now this additional. So yep, John, you're right. This didn't last very long. The president told them it would be out there and it's only been out for a few weeks, but it's speaking of funding though, that's part of the challenge right now, John. Decoupling government shutdown from COVID-19 is also part of it, speaking of government funding.
And our conventional wisdom is recently 2 weeks ago that the September 30th deadline, that's when the government runs out of money, the fiscal year ends, and the Congress needs to pass their spending bills. And so the conventional wisdom is that the Congress would use a continuing resolution to keep the government funding to also include the next phase of a stimulus package. Well, Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, met, and they both realized that the risk of shutting down the government is too great. Nobody wins with the government shutdown. And so let's instead negotiate a continuing resolution, decoupling it from the next phase of the stimulus package, and that's what they're doing right now. So why is this? Why are both sides seeing this as a benefit? Well, the White House and the Senate, they see, a potential loss with the government shut. They would be blamed for a potential government shutdown, and such. And so that is the motivation of having Treasury move forward with this. But now the question is how long will that continuing resolution to keep the government funding? The Speaker Pelosi would love to extend the government funding through mid-February. That assumes that Biden wins the White House, Democrats win the control of the United States Senate, and so they just punt everything through February. McConnell and Senate Republicans, say not so fast. They're looking at something like in mid-December, sometime in December, a funding bill through December. When you look at history, traditionally when Congress passes a continuing resolution, they do it nearly every year, nearly every 2 years, is the continuing resolution goes through Thanksgiving, and then they come back after the election, and then there'll be some sort of deadline. It may be as early as December 1, it may be December 15th, but we don't see funding extended much beyond December 15th, and that's where you have real pressure when members of Congress worry that they're going to be wrapping their holiday gifts, in their offices because the Congress still has their work to do. But and so that's what we see moving forward. Omar, why don't you describe a little bit about this, what McConnell was trying to do with the skinny bill and how it failed yesterday?
Yeah, that's right. And we'll talk a little bit more about the politics of the skinny bill here coming up on the next slide. But he definitely needed to do something. And where we ended up, and the reason we ended up at a size of a bill from McConnell that we did in Senate Republicans is because going back, I think John reported it on our August 14th or so webinar that at that point, McConnell was trying to actually move a $1 trillion bill. But it was very clear he had at least 20 of his own senators that were going to vote against it, and possibly as high as 25 out of 53 GOP senators opposing it, which would have meant he'd have to overwhelmingly rely on Senate Democrats, meaning Chuck Schumer, and indirectly Nancy Pelosi, if he wanted to get the 60 votes in order to move anything. So that obviously being an untenable situation, but at the same time, he's boxed in. So he's got some folks like the Ted Cruz of the world and the Rand Paul that don't want more spending, but he also wants to hang on to the Senate, which we'll talk about in a second. So he had to do something. In doing so, his compromise was to get what we're calling a skinny bill. So instead of the $1 trillion proposal he had in mid-August, he came forward with about $300 billion in new money. Effectively, they took $350 billion of existing authorization of funding between the Federal Reserve and Treasury and the PPP and other programs. They rescinded that and then reprogrammed it, combined it with another 300. So they're calling it a $650 billion bill or so. But effectively, it's $300 billion in new money. Only $105 billion for new schools, nothing for states and locals, and that's where the big hangup is that the Democrats want $1 trillion. It does also, to the previous slide and the John's point and some of the comments in the chat room here, it does include from the Republican bill a $300 federal unemployment supplement, though it does not include the Trump $1,200 checks that he wants that we'll touch on. And then lastly here on the PPP program, Again, it does rescind it and then bring back in, so it'll up it and bring in, right now, PPP closed on August 8th. It'll bring us up to $258 billion in total funds available for a PPP 1. It does make the supplier costs eligible, as we discussed a few weeks ago in the Rubio proposal. It does give us better flexibility on 8 weeks. It does not address the deduction and expenses issue, but we think that they intentionally left that out to be able to deal with it in a more serious package if we get there. And it does include a second draw. But I mean, John, is this really a real bill, or is this a political bill? Why did McConnell do this? We just like to give people, make sure you understand that not all proposals are intended to become law, and some of them are often just either negotiating or political exercises. John?
Yeah, and this was a political bill, and you know this because it was just basically a party line vote. When you want something really done in Washington, those are when you see the true bipartisan votes. This bill failed. It had 52 votes, had a majority, but is far short of the 60 votes necessary to become law. Why did McConnell do it? He had to take care of the 4 or 5 vulnerable Republicans who are up for re-election. They needed to vote for it. They need to go to the voters saying that they voted for something rather than just being against it. McConnell struggled to get even the 52 votes, even for that skinny bill. And he was sending a message to Schumer and Pelosi that if I can't get 52 votes or more than 52 votes on a $650 billion bill, how am I going to get Republican votes for a $2 trillion bill, that a much larger bill that many of the House and Senate Democrats are looking at? McConnell also wanted to put some of the Democrats on the defensive. The Democrats passed their $3.4 trillion HEROES bill several months ago, and nothing has happened since then. And they wanted the extended unemployment and stuff like that, which was included in this little skinny bill. And so that's why he felt he was putting Democrats on defensive. It's uncertain. I don't think Omar and I know whether this is helpful or harmful in whether future negotiations, whether it's going to help in future negotiations moving forward. The only negotiations that are really happening right now are on the keeping the government funding, as I mentioned earlier, is a continuing resolution. Those discussions have to be concluded by September 30th. That's when the government runs out of money, and that's when you'll think they'll turn to that next package. Pelosi has gone down from the 3.4 trillion in their HEROES bill down to 2.2 trillion. And the White House has gone from McConnell's initial $1.2 trillion bill to 1.5 trillion. So we are between 2.2 trillion and 1.5 trillion away from getting some sort of deal, and that is the challenge. Secretary Mnuchin does see a pathway moving forward to getting a deal. Even prior to the election, we know the White House is very interested in getting this deal, specifically the individual payments moving forward. And I think Pelosi perhaps sees a roadmap moving forward, as long as Mark Meadows, the president's chief of staff, is not in the room during the negotiating. They have a bad relationship moving forward, and as negotiations move forward, she is asking that she just be allowed to negotiate with Mnuchin. So, Omar, what are some of the politics of this COVID legislation moving forward? Why is it going to work, and why is it not going to work?
Yeah, I think you hit on some of it there. And again, Pelosi and the president have not spoken since October 16th of 2019. So we're coming up literally on 12 months here, just about, since the last time the head of the executive and legislative branches spoke to one another. And that's the challenge, is what's the heavy in the room? Does Mnuchin really have the backing of the president? I think he does, just because I think John's point there is the president does want to see checks out there with his name on it, but there are still some obstacles. McConnell would need to get to 60 votes in order to pass, and no matter what, the math is still what it is. You need at least 7 Democrats to join all 53 Republicans in order to do so, and there still isn't that pathway unless there's going to be movement on funding for states, and the McConnell bill had 0, and clearly Democrats are looking for something that starts with a T in terms of their total, but I think they'd probably settle for 600 to 750 billion in the end for the states and the locals in the air. But again, some of the Republicans believe that the jobs numbers on Friday, showing that it's continued to tick at least the top line up, and unemployment rate ticking down, gives them some more political cover to do less or do nothing, frankly. And now that to John's earlier point, that you've got the senators in North Carolina, Colorado, Arizona, and Maine in particular that can say, hey, look, we did pass a bill. It's out here. It's got our PPP in it. That maybe gives them enough political cover to go back to voters and say, see, it's not us. It's actually Democrats that are the ones that to blame. So that's the question, is who's to take the blame? The White House thinks Pelosi will get it. Democrats believe it'll be Trump since he's the figurehead of the government that's out there. So that's really the blame game. And now the thing that, though, you jump to the other side of what are some of the reasons why this could happen. And again, it's politics. So we're not trying to inject politics into this in this presentation, but I think you have to. And because you have to look at how the politics are driving policy, which is always the case, unfortunately, in this town. So yes, we had to write down it's the right thing to do. People, businesses still need help, but let's move to reality. Trump definitely wants to see his name on $1,200 checks that go out just days or weeks before the election. And by the way, folks, people just started voting in North Carolina. So this is definitely something he wants to do. Moderate House Democrats are really chirping at Pelosi. We heard yesterday that it's Majority Leader Hoyer specifically brought up on the call yesterday that he wants to see something on COVID-19 attached to the coronavirus bill. The response from Pelosi is, when you go to the dance, you don't get weak-kneed right at the end of it. So she believes that they're still in the stretch of negotiations and all Democrats must stay united. And that's why she's keeping her caucus from splitting up and putting more pressure to move a bill. She's very well prepared to go into the election without a bill that's out there. John, before we turn it over to Caitlin to throw up a poll, you want to give your percentage? I'm still hovering at 10% chance between now and September 30th. We do actually get some kind of a COVID bill done. I think I'm in the minority. Are you below 10? Are you at 0? Where are you?
By getting a bill by September 30th, I think we're at 0. I am more optimistic about getting a bill sometime in October, to some of the points that you brought up. You know, I want to bring up the jobs report. Republicans see the jobs report, both sides see the jobs report, the August jobs report, as beneficial to them. Republicans say 1.5 million new jobs, 8.9% unemployment rate, which is a good thing. Pelosi says only 1.5 million jobs created. And so therefore, that's why we need a larger bill. And to your point earlier, Omar, I think with the dynamics moving forward, with the expiration of the unemployment benefits state by state, and it's going to go state by state as we talked about, that's going to put pressure on the Democrats to move something forward. And then there's pressure. Trump is, pressuring Republicans to get those individual payments moving forward. So that's why I'm more optimistic about getting something done, perhaps in October, October surprise, October 15th timeframe. But if not, I think when they come back after the election, it probably will move quickly. So
yeah, and then you've got the 236,000 census workers that were accounted for in the hiring of some of those numbers. The real unemployment, the U6 that we look at, that's at 14.3%. So, but I agree with you. I think the Republicans definitely won the top line number from just the headlines of it. But speaking of headlines, Caitlin, let's go ahead and run that poll if you don't mind. If we don't mind, folks, we just want to focus on the PPP here for a second. So I'll just go ahead, and if you don't mind launching that, I'll turn it over to Caitlin.
Yeah, go ahead. So I'm going to put this poll up on the screen. As you can see, here's the question. If you took out a Paycheck Protection Program loan, have you spent all of the borrowed funds? Here's why we're asking. We know that a lot of our members, about 90%, took out PPP loans. And we know that a lot of members have already reported to us that if there were additional aid available, they would be interested in getting that aid. This kind of information is really helpful for us when talking with media, and to Omar and John when talking with elected officials about where our members are in terms of having used the funding that they've already received, when we might anticipate that members will run into additional complications. So that's why we ask you these kind of questions, and really appreciate your participation.
One of the reasons we're asking this is, if you're in the retail business, or if you're in the restaurant business and you shut down your restaurant, yes, it may not have spent your money, and so there is discussions and talk that, well, why do we need to extend the PPP program? Because people still have money available, and we want to demonstrate, because I think we're going to see from these survey results that a overwhelming majority of our members ended up spending the money. We may be wrong, but that's why we're specifically asking this question of you, so we can then counter some of the arguments who say we don't need to extend the PPP because there's still money in the pipeline.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Caitlin. Thank you very much. So the results came back in here, as some of you just saw that you published it, at 75% said yes, that they've already exhausted all their funds, 13% no, 12% did not take a PPP loan from the Small Business Administration. So that is about in line with what we've actually expected. We kind of were guessing around. We thought it was about 70 to 80% had used all your funds. And to John's point, what that helps us understand is when we go with that sense of urgency to Capitol Hill, saying this is why we need a second draw. This is why we need to watch some of these economic numbers. And also, by the way, when we send out our survey next week that we hope all of you fill out, we are going to ask the question, just as we did in the past, what are you going to do now that your PPP funds have run out? Do you have enough business to keep folks on payroll, or are you going to start looking at furlough and release? And that's some of the questions that policymakers are going to have to face. And that's also why we're asking this question on forgiveness guidance. Again, we're not your CPAs or attorneys, but we're doing the best we can to give you some tools and tips based on what we've learned. We've been getting inundated, John and I have been the last 10 days or so, with members asking, what should we do on forgiveness? There was a question here as well that ties into the slide. When we start with the question, we'll go into some of our suggestions on forgiveness. The question that came in, is the SBA accepting forgiveness applications for PPP loans? Technically, the answer is yes. The portal opened on August 6th, or excuse me, August 10th, and people and some banks are in fact submitting through that portal. We do know of some individual member companies who have submitted. However, most banks are still hesitant to process a lot of the forgiveness applications simply because they're expecting some changes. Now, whether those changes to the PPP occur in the month of September, as some of us still are holding out hope for, or they occur after the election, some still do believe that we are going to see some significant and structural enough changes to this program whereby lenders are suggesting let's not deal with amending it and dealing with changes later on. Let's maybe hold off. So yes, the portal is technically open. We do know of companies who have submitted, none who have had it forgiven in full yet and fully processed by SBA. And we believe, again, it's because of that. Now let's start with some language that comes directly at the top here from an interim final rule and IFR that was issued with regards to the PPP program. As long as a borrower submits its loan forgiveness application within 10 months of the completion of the covered period, the borrower is not required to make any payments until the forgiveness amount is remitted to the lender by SBA. So that pretty much puts us in no earlier than February, really, of 2021, but most likely into March or realistically even in April of 2021. Now, this is where you need to talk to your CPAs and also check with your CFOs. Maybe you've got some other loan covenants that are out there and some separate loans that say you cannot have anything else on your books over a certain size for a certain period. So you might have some reasons there you want to get this loan off your books, and that might be the sense of urgency. But a lot of folks, as we mentioned, the lenders are hesitant to accept it. And if you don't have to submit your loan forgiveness application now, can you hold out, wait, and hope? Now, are we telling you hold out hope that Congress will do the right thing and overcome politics and act? No, obviously we're not giving you that advice. But if we do, some of us still believe changes will come eventually, maybe even in December, that likely will still very much fit within your 10-month window that you're looking at here. And again, you still don't have a solution on the September 15th on next Tuesday's quarterly payment that many of you have due with regards to the deduction of expenses if your loan is forgiven. Obviously, your loan has not been forgiven. Therefore, you technically can still continue to deduct as expenses, utilities and wages as you normally would from the PPP. So that's, again, something you want to talk to your CPA. You've got that 10-month from that period, from that clock going. And that's something you should go and ask yourself, can we hold off to wait? John, do you think that we'll even, let's just assume we don't get something here in September. Do you think in lame duck we'll get something? Because I think some of these fixes are pretty bipartisan. Both sides want to make them. Don't you think, at least maybe in December?
Yeah, I mean, I want to remain the optimist, and hopefully we'll get something in mid-October. But worst case scenario, with the expiration of the unemployment, which is number 1, 2, and 3 on the Democrats' wish list, the state and local funding, many states are fiscal year start October 1. They're in trouble. They've got real budget problems. And so I think regardless who wins the White House and who wins the Senate, something will be done in the lame duck. They come back the week after the election. They're here for organizational meetings, freshman orientation. They'll be here through Thanksgiving. They'll likely come back in early December. So that's when a lot of the work gets done. And I am very optimistic that if it's not done by October, it'll be done by December.
And the one thing I'd change to that is if Trump wins, yes, I think there'll definitely be a robust lame duck session. However, if Schumer takes the Senate and Trump loses, We don't see why Pelosi would allow anything of substance to move. We believe that they're going to shut it down and want to be able to put their imprint on it with the trifecta, which is where we would look for a very quick shot in the arm stimulus bill that moves somewhere around the last week of September, last week of January, early in February, that might even tie in some of the federal spending. So unfortunately, again, yes, politics is driving policy. That's why we've got to watch a little bit of both. But with that, we did just want to present you just a little bit more of our thoughts, knowing that a bill may not move. What do you all do? This is some of the advice that we started to collect from folks that are out there. But we do want to go back over to Bracewell and kind of have them touch base a little bit on an issue that's actually been almost half the questions that we've gotten now, which is regard to unemployment insurance.
Thanks, Omar. Yeah, so there has been a lot of discussion, I know, within both associations about the impact of unemployment, the extension of unemployment benefits and the increase in unemployment benefits on the willingness, A, the willingness of workers to return to work, B, the ability of our manufacturers to find workers. We had have a lot of anecdotal evidence from folks on this call, I'm sure, who are attending, and others in the industries, telling us that, directly, that they're being told by some of the folks that when they put out a job opening that, that people are preferring to stay home because of the unemployment benefits. And that could be a combination of, also obviously COVID related, that fear of going back to work and maybe having to take care of a loved one, or maybe having a kid at home, but that the unemployment benefits are creating a disincentive for folks to go back to work. And we've had, our evidence is really that these job openings that were being filled at a quicker pace now are remaining open for a long time, and you can't find workers. So, the media has been following this issue as well. We got an inquiry from the New York Times a few weeks ago. And what the story in the New York Times, ultimately we had PMA member Jeff Asnavorian offered to speak to the reporter, and just reported, I think this shows that we're playing an important role in this debate, because Jeff just reported what he's experiencing. Now it's the New York Times, and the bent of the New York Times is sympathetic to perhaps the more liberal side of things. So the reporter reported on several economic studies which show that there isn't a disincentive, that the unemployment benefits, increased unemployment benefits, are not creating a disincentive for people to go back to work. And the reporter cited 5 studies by both conservative and liberal think tanks. But I think she did a fair job in juxtaposing that against the real world experiences that our members having. And I thought Jeff did a great job in handling the issue and just saying, hey, this is what we're experiencing. And I think this shows that our voice is very important in these debates. That it's one thing for an economist to look at some data, and for another thing for you folks to report on what's really going on out there. And it's going to be a continued debate before Congress. We're going to make sure that Omar and John are armed with all the information that they need, but it shows the important role that we play. I'm sure that this New York Times reporter, when I get a request, it's not only going to me, but it's going to a lot of different contacts that she has in the manufacturing world. And the fact that she chose to talk to Jeff, and that she sent a photographer to Jeff's place, shows how we are impactful, number one, and that our folks know what they're talking about. So I thought it was a good experience. You can find it. We've put up the link to the New York Times article on social media, and it's easy to find on the New York Times website.
And just a quick plug, you can tune in to hear from us on our Talking with One Voice podcast. You can find it on both associations' websites and social media accounts. You can also find it anywhere where you find podcasts. We're talking a lot about policy, about COVID legislation and regulation, but we're also talking a lot about politics as we get nearer and nearer to the 2020 presidential. On our last episode, we talked about concerns over mail-in voter fraud, as well as what our predictions were. And you know, we are excellent at predictions, so do tune in to hear that. We'll be back. We do the podcast every other week when we don't do the webinar. So we'll have a new episode up next week. We usually upload them on Thursdays, so you can find it then.
John, before we jump into questions, you want to talk a little bit about fundraising, be able to support the association's efforts?
Yeah, if you like what we've been doing and have found these webinars to be helpful and you want them to continue, we hope you would recognize this by making a generous contribution to NTMA's GAF account, which is, you can use corporate contributions to support the GAF, or PMA's Advocacy Fund, again, two funds that you could use corporate dollars to support. In addition to providing these webinars, we have just initiated having virtual meetings with PMA districts and NTMA chapters, and we've had really good success of member participation, member turnout, member interest in politics. We had one yesterday with Tennessee, and one of the members contacted us right after the webinar the Zoom with the member of Congress. He said, I want to make a contribution. And so we're thrilled by that kind of enthusiasm. Those of you who are on this webinar who have the ability, we recognize economic conditions for many facilities is tenuous, but it's also, do we make these contributions to further the industry collectively, or do we just look at ourselves individually? So we hope you'll consider making a contribution to either the GAF or the PMA Advocacy Fund moving forward.
Thanks,
With that,
John.
I guess questions.
They'll still appear here on the slide for questions. If you haven't already typed one in, please do so on the right-hand side. Also, feel free to email us directly if you want to discuss something privately offline, such as the one question about 270 to win. We'll email you about this afterwards with regards to the predictions there. One question we did get here on a serious note, that you definitely are going to want to talk to your CPA, but we'll at least give you the Washington perspective on it. My year end, meaning my fiscal year, ends here coming up September 30th. Assuming I have to take income in the year I took expenses, I have to get forgiveness sooner rather than later. We can't obviously speak onto the CPA advice side, but we can give you the sooner or later side based on the previous slides that you just saw from us. If you have already, in fact, submitted your forgiveness application, that they've got up to 60 days or so in order to make a decision, and then depends on that decision, there's another process that follows beyond that. So even if you were to have submitted and had it all done by, say, in wanting to have it off your book September 30th, you likely, on the worst case rather scenario, accounting for that 60-day, would have done that a couple of months ago. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't rapid turnarounds. We just haven't heard of any specific companies that have yet to have their loan forgiven, and we've always been taught never say never, so we don't want to say with the certainty that no one has, but we will ask around, and we'll talk to the NFIB lobbyists and see if any of the smallest companies that maybe had a 15, 20,000 loan have had it forgiven, but we're not aware of that yet. So as far as the timing of September 30th, we see that it would be very difficult in order for that, even if it's been filed, for that deadline to be met. So that's, again, something where we always like to say, work your way backwards from, especially if you're a government contract. Yes, we could see you aligning a lot of you at either that September 30th, April 30th, and obviously the end of the year. So watch out and work your way backwards, but definitely expect patience, especially if the lenders are expecting more changes to come from Congress, which at some point very well may likely happen. Any other questions? I know we may have left you with even fewer answers than when you came in here, but again, we're hopeful that in 2 weeks from today, when we're on our next webinar, we'll give you at least with more definitive answer what's going on from Capitol Hill. With that, thank you everyone for joining us today. Feel free to reach out anytime for any questions you may have.